Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the current president, was elected this past summer. She is a Jewish climate scientist, just about as different as you could think the Mexican population was looking for at the time. But she's a pretty seasoned politician. And it's been really interesting because her entire campaign was different than expected because she ran against a woman. And so that makes the entire sort of gender dynamic very different than what we've seen play out with Vice President Harris and Donald Trump. The Mexican electorate, which often follows the U.S. electorate in terms of conservative and more liberal flows and ebbs, went a very different direction following the presidency of Donald Trump, which was, instead of the right shifting more right and the left shifting more left, the left shifted more center and the right shifted more center. Meaning that there's the same sort of culture wars in many ways that goes on because media is very transnational, right? And so these things that you can kind of think of as identity politics, the limits of identity politics, cultural difference, religious fighting, and all that same thing goes on in Mexico in its own iteration, its own nuances, but it's happening and it's influenced by the United States. But these two candidates were fascinating. Xochitl Galvez, who was the center-right candidate running against the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is more conservative, is an indigenous Otomi speaker, and so she represented for a long time the indigenous communities in the government of Vicente Fox, and is a center-right candidate on many issues, but is occasionally very liberal, if you want to say that, on reproductive rights. And so this was a kind of fascinating election because usually people in the United States and Mexican-American citizens also often consider the U.S. as the beacon of hope for feminism in the region. And that, I think, does a disservice to the connections of grassroots feminists throughout the Americas. So it's pretty interesting to see the way in which there's an assumption that Mexico is a really machista society. It couldn't possibly elect a woman. And not only did it elect a woman, but it was inevitably going to elect a woman in this election. And I think it's really fascinating because it is an outgrowth of the Me Too movement, which is paralleled in a more radical movement in Latin America called Ni Uno Menos. And Ni Uno Menos was very similar in terms of recognizing gender violence on a spectrum, right? So that, yes, there's things like assault, there's violence, there's inequity, but there's also slights, there's microaggressions, there's things that allow for more grave inequities to exist. Do you know what I mean? So in the corrupt state that Mexico often has, there's a lot of ways in which women have been vulnerable to police violence, to job inequity and harassment. And all of those have really been addressed by this grassroots movement that has said, hey, look, we're going to have some women and feminists that are men as well who are very Catholic and who are not going to support reproductive rights. And yet, we have to do something about the violence against women. And so this really exploded in 2016 in this way, and it supported so many women candidates at that point in Mexico that it got them to the point that they're at now, where basically they had to make it impossible not to elect a woman. You would have had to overlook like the top 9, which they're able to do. Trust me, they could have found a way. Many did. But they would have had to ignore quite a lot of very charismatic and qualified candidates. So it's just been very interesting to look at this. And what's going to be even more interesting is to see how these grassroots groups really continue to push Sheinbaum, who's pretty centrist for a center-left for Mexico, forward. And I think it also ties in with the current debates that Vice President Harris has been very criticized for some of her statements on immigration, particularly in her trips to Central America. And I think it would actually behoove any party to kind of look at Mexico as a place with its own politics that actually might offer some really interesting counterexamples of when we fear what can't be, whether it's a kind of political discourse that's very civil, even with real strong differences. There are examples out there, and I would just, urge you to look at these two women, and also to think about, if you were to do that, if you were to take Latin America, and particularly Mexico, on its own terms, as a place of innovation at times, even though very problematic at other times, because it's really going through problems of militarization, and either candidate would have to deal with that, and that's going to be a whole bag of problems for a woman already gendered as maybe weaker with the military, unable to take care of the military, right? But I think it would behoove us, how different would the immigration debate be if we actually, and I don't mean you might not be part of this, right? But I mean, if dominant discourse was to take other countries' politics in a more serious and sometimes maybe even interested or admiring way, and change the way that we see the people from those countries too. So I think those issues are really connected, and I'll just be as interested in that as I am to see how grassroots women's movements and feminist movements deal with a President Harris, if that is the case, and how they put different pressure here and there, because I do think they come from a similar set of concerns in the Americas, which is patriarchy is transnationalism. Is transnational, right? Sexism is transnational. So is feminism. And many of these people cross these borders all the time, and they have similar and shared problems. So, just throwing that out. And that's it for me.
Good. This is wonderful because we've been looking at women's leadership from above, right, in terms of presidential power. But I'm also so glad you mentioned grassroots women's organizations where leadership is so abundant and so effective. And it pushes me to think a little bit about, interrogating the whole concept of what is leadership in general. We used to say, well, is it the person? Is it the moment? Is it the movement? And that particularly in looking at women's power, women's leadership, I think it's so important to understand both the timing of things, of course, the history of things, but also to understand the movements that are behind and of which women's leadership is the expression. And, there's a lot of work on this. Of course, many of you are familiar with Carol Gilligan's work where she talked in a different voice about, and this is Adele's first good question about, is it significant or what does it look like? And obviously it's different in a lot of cases, what women's leadership looks like. Is it more inclusive? Is it more communitarian? Is it more creative in terms of collective problem solving? Are we romanticizing that? Sometimes that can happen, right? And of course, again, we realize, leadership towards what? In which direction? Solving which problems? We don't need to cite them, but, the Margaret Thatcherization of women's leadership, right? Or women who are not particularly interested in what might traditionally be called women's issues or women's concerns. And again, there's problems with that. We don't want to ghettoize women's issues as being somehow separate from these other fundamental concerns in society. But I do think, we want to think about what is leadership, even with the glass ceiling metaphor. Maybe it's not so much a question of smashing the glass ceiling, which glass ceiling? I think we have to ask, what kind of world will be represented by women's leadership? And that's not always, there's a big difference there, lots of difference. So I do think, though, and I'm just going to cite a couple of women's movements and the kind of leadership that they produce, which I do think is distinctive, which is more inclusive, all of those things I just mentioned, that is more about power with rather than power over others, just to oversimplify it. And yes, there is something distinctive about being not just, one's own great leadership, right? That's important. But again, in what direction, with what values, with what goals, what kind of vision is being proposed. And I think, and again, I don't want to romanticize women's leadership. I think that's important not to. But I don't think there's any question that women's experience, the historical evolution of women as caretakers, these things are absolutely essential and fundamental. So let me just mention a couple of examples that I've been looking at and that I think are interesting. In two very different parts of the world, one in Northern Ireland, and where there was, as everyone knows, a long period of very bloody civil war. They called it the Troubles, to euphemize it a bit, but where you had horrible religious, sectarian, colonial, really, and neo-colonial struggles going on. And it was women who were able to reach across divides, across very profound, violent divides, and try to forge alternatives. So in one case, and this goes back a long time, these struggles aren't, magically over quickly, but the kind of leadership that came out of horrible crisis, particularly, that was, sectarian violence on a scale that people could not have imagined, that kind of leadership, stepping into that gap between warring parties, which has incredible dangers, huge stakes, but also ultimately a great reward. So, going back into the 70s, there were two women, Mairead Maguire and Betty Williams, who, again, coming from very different communities in the midst of horrible violence that had occurred, had the courage to speak to each other, to work together, to begin to forge a new space. And they were eventually successful. That morphed into what was called the Peace People, and they actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for their extremely courageous work. Further downstream, another instance, a similar instance in Northern Ireland, where some of you may be familiar with the fact that 2 years ago there was the 25th anniversary of what was called the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which brought a provisional peace to Northern Ireland. But there's an amazing story about women's leadership, and again, leadership that distilled out of a movement, a real movement. It wasn't top down; it was absolutely grassroots, and clearly there were people who were leading and were taking huge risks. But what was amazing was the Women's Coalition, it was called. Again, people like Monica McWilliams, who's now a professor in Queen's University in Belfast, and Pearl Saget, across, again, religious lines, in opposition to their respective communities in many cases, but were able to, along with a range of women, were able to step into that process, did amazing work, campaigning, organizing, and again, the creative organizing that they did should also be noted, because I do think that's another distinctive feature often of women's leadership. And the Women's Coalition was able to really play a major role in the crafting of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, much to everyone's shock, because, and some of you may have seen, we have this great film I'd recommend to you called Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs, right? You can probably guess who the dinosaurs were, and you can probably guess who was waving. But it was it's an extraordinary story in the face of opposition, again, male opposition especially, from all quarters. They were told, go home, clean your house, take care of your children. You don't belong in the public sphere. Right? So this was an extraordinary accomplishment, and played a real role substantively, content-wise, in crafting the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So that's one example. Whole other part of the world, Liberia. And another good film, by the way, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which many of you may be familiar with. And by the way, who were influenced by the struggle of the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland. 2 years ago, Monica McWilliams went to Liberia at that anniversary at their invitation because she had played such a key role. So look at the internationalization that you're talking about. In any case, in this film, again, forged in the horrors of war, right? The women's peace movement there, began to bravely, and this was the era of Charles Taylor and horrible, brutal, authoritarian repression that was going on. It was a time of child soldiers, which was one of the main motivating forces for both sides of this divide, for these two groups of women to get together. And so again, I can't stress how horrible the conditions were, but these women reached again across religious lines, Christians and Muslims working together, getting to know each other. So it was in that process itself that I think the union became so strong, and were able to begin to actually tackle the horrors of what was going on with such creativity and such brilliance. They used the cultural norms. They used the Lysistrata strategy, right? They tried everything and were extraordinarily, miraculously able to turn the tide. Charles Taylor finally fled after an attempt to arrest him by the ICC, which is a whole other story. But in any case, the fact that they were able to do this, such courage. Can you imagine? You know, they could have all been gathered up, tortured, killed, you know, in a moment. But working together, getting to know each other, struggling together, they were actually able to turn the tide of history. And the result of that, one result, there were many results, they had to work with former child soldiers. They had to put a society back together after the horrors that had been endured on both sides. What was amazing was, and so now instead of grassroots, we're talking top down, was the election of Helen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the first female president in all of Africa. She was elected as president of Liberia. So here you see a kind of amazing example of once this process is opened up, once women are able to step into this gap between violent parties. And again, this is not, you know, these are two dramatic examples because they were both in situations of war and horror and repression. But that they were able to then not only stop the war, but transform the political system. Yes, there's been some, you know, retrograde motion in the meantime. These things substantively don't change overnight. But the fact that in both of these cases, these women leaders, but again, leaders tied intimately to movements, to critical social grassroots movements. So I think that that's one of the features that is so important here. It's not simply, you know, yes, I'm all for breaking the glass ceiling and seeing more female leadership at the top of these various organizations, including, you know, presidencies. But it can never be disembodied. It can't be separated from these extraordinary critical movements where women have again stepped up, stepped in, and been enabled a transformation of the whole society. So again, I love the fact that, you know, here you have these women in Northern Ireland who are, you know, struggling their own sectarian, violent conflicts, but who then have also been inspired by the Women's Coalition, the Peace Coalition in Liberia, again illustrating just how universal these struggles are, how global these struggles are, how important it is to learn from each other. Again, I think another thing that is kind of distinctive about women's leadership and women's movements, there's a certain humility about going together, right? But also learning from each other, being able to grow and become empowered, not only as individual leaders, but also as critical social movements. And that's, after all, I think how things change, both from above and from below, both as individual leaders, but also leaders that are always connected to and subject to progressive, creative, empowering movements on the ground. Again, good enough.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers for their opening remarks. I know I have these questions here, but I have a few questions about the things that you guys discussed. Feel free to answer any of them, but each of your talks gave me different questions. First, I want to talk about, my first question is, what's the significance of having women leaders in society? But I actually want to ask about the significance of the glass ceiling and the importance of honoring these historic events and even considering them historic, because women could have integrated into society and didn't acknowledge, without acknowledging where they started and where they are now. Like, in the case that Kamala Harris isn't really talking about her gender as much, she's ignoring her gender, is that what's the significance of acknowledging your gender and reminding people that you are a woman who is doing these things in society, and it's important because of where women started and where they are now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's so interesting to have this kind of larger global perspective. I'm taking both with the comparison to what's happening in Mexico, right, in North America and South America, in Mexico, and then also with this idea of leaders and movements and kind of the building blocks that get to the person who's the most visible, but is maybe the face of the movement, but is completely undergirded by this strong support. So to take that question, I think the challenge, I would say, for the Harris campaign, presidential campaign, is to recognize history, and I have no doubt, whatever happens on election day, that will be recognized. I mean, this is history making. It could be really big history making, or it could be very different, right? And so we'll see where that goes. But the challenge of recognizing that without focusing on it at the expense of issues that matter to voters. And I think, maybe a good comparison here is Hillary 2008, because when you look back at the supporters for Hillary Clinton when she was running against Senator Obama for the Democratic nomination, a lot of Democratic leaders thought that that it was too soon for Obama, that he should wait his turn, that Hillary had been waiting a long time, had been prepping for this really since she was an undergraduate at Wellesley, where she was widely viewed among her peers as someone who would run for president. A Bill Clinton administration official who worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign famously said there's a special place in hell for women who don't vote for other women. And that was very controversial, not surprisingly, because what you had were many, Hillary Clinton had a lot of support. That was a very close competition in 2008. But there were some generational differences. People who had kind of lived through the time period Hillary had, who really thought it was time for a woman president. And a lot of, I would say, younger students, including college students who were, I saw this on campus, who were very excited by Obama and thought that there should be a woman president one day, right? There definitely should be, but it didn't necessarily have to be Hillary. And so to bring that up to Harris, I think that what Vice President Harris is doing is kind of talking about issues that matter to voters, and that includes discrimination. It includes, if you look at her, the movement behind her, there have been articles about her, the historically black sorority. They don't endorse candidates, but how much they've been working behind the scenes in support of her Vice President Harris. You can point to a lot of other examples of groups that are supporting the Harris campaign, but to say that the issue here is not, you're not voting for gender, you're voting for the person, right? And that it's a part of the narrative, but it's not the full narrative. And I think it's risky for a candidate to lean too much into identity. I mean, we could talk about this with Obama and race as well, right? But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I mean, I guess I would just agree with what I think we're all seeing, and what you're all probably seeing is the limits of representation, of identity politics, right? Which is, you want representation. Representation is shown to do all kinds of things, whether it be in a boardroom or a classroom or a faculty or whatever you have. It's very important to have those voices, to have that leadership. At the same time, there's a nuance to it, which is, does Marjorie Taylor Greene represent feminists? And she doesn't want to. She would absolutely refute that. She would say, that's not what I'm in politics to do. I'm in politics to actually bring things back to the traditional family and the way things belong. I don't want to be out here running politics. I want to be home. But I can't because you keep doing crazy liberal things, right? So that's the limits of representation, right? That there's people may not hold the beliefs that you hope that they may to progress the people that they supposedly represent, but then maybe do represent some, but not all. And so they're just individuals, right? So to a certain extent, I don't know what Vice President Harris could really gain from only talking about that. She's very strong on reproductive rights. There's no question what she thinks about it. She's not sort of like wishy-washy. She's not like, I don't know, maybe. She's really clear. So I think it makes a lot of sense because I don't think it's really helped a lot of women candidates to lean into their identity. And I don't think there's any denying that she's a woman. I don't think anyone's confused. And so I just think strategically, in a perfect world, we'd all be celebrating the potential of having a woman candidate. But in our world, I think strategically, I think she's probably right to not constantly be talking about that.
Yeah, I would completely agree that strategically it wouldn't be wise. But also I think she wants to lead with competence, with experience. There's no question about her policies. She hasn't shied away from the struggles for reproductive rights, as you mentioned. But yeah, identity politics is tricky. On the one hand, yes, representation is important. Having voices at the table and faces at the table that truly represent the population, that's absolutely critical. But too much of it, right, is polarizing, or when it's used as the sort of lead encounter, it can really be problematic. And I think she's been actually smart in trying to strategically, walk through those landmines of reaction, and and even more so as a woman of color. And I've been a little impressed. I'm not happy about all of her policies, but I've been very impressed with this sort of strategic sophistication of that, because it is a bit of a landmine. Even now you see the ways in which, without necessarily speaking of it, but gender issues are right there below the surface when you look at the polling, when you look at some of the analysis of what's going on with people's reactions in different interest groups and whatnot. And so I think she's actually handled that landmine very well.
Can I just add, and just one point, we haven't talked a lot about Nikki Haley, right, who was the candidate on the Republican side who went the furthest in challenging former President Trump for the Republican nomination. She didn't get very far, but she outlasted candidates who were widely seen, Governor DeSantis from Florida, right, being a prime example of as being much more likely to have a competitive campaign. And I think that's kind of an interesting example there. I think without a doubt, Nikki Haley will run again in some form. She has endorsed Donald Trump and she spoke at the convention. But if you think it's important to have a woman as president, would you vote for a Haley or a Harris or Clinton, right? Or would it, or when you look at Elizabeth Warren. Sorry, I was like, no, I wasn't saying Marjorie Taylor Greene. I was saying Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar or Tulsi Gabbard, right, who's actually working for the Trump campaign now, briefly. But it's so gender alone can't possibly be enough of a reason, maybe for a small sliver of people. But when you look at even, and Tulsi Gabbard was not a major party candidate for very long, but when you look at, or was not really competitive, but even the major party candidates, there are other variables: partisanship, economic leadership, foreign policy, that you kind of take all of these together, these kind of cross-cutting cleavages, to use a social science term.
Thank you all. We've discussed a lot of the barriers that women face when seeking leadership positions, but how can organizations like these grassroots movements help dismantle these barriers? Or uplift them in ways where it seems not possible?
I mean, I would again make the argument for grassroots collective action, right? That's often what deals with many of these barriers. Women need to empower, I hope this isn't a small sheet, but, women need to empower each other. Women need to work together to learn from each other. And I think that can't be I want to be, in this great position we live in a world, particularly in the U.S., of hyper-individualism. And I think that kind of, for example, like with Nikki Haley, I mean, there's such opportunism there. Now she's completely shifted, from the critique. And I think our political culture encourages that. It's like winning is everything. And I think to overcome the barriers substantially, it's like, how do we create community? How do we create movements? How do we create collective action in grassroots ways that give women not only the experience of leadership individually, but also really how to work with other people, how to have common goals that benefit all, those kinds of things. It's almost like a moral development as well. And that pushes against so much of what's in our culture, doesn't it? I mean, that it's, where people are almost sort of survivalists in terms of the political culture. And so I guess overcoming the obstacles, the barriers, really does mean reaching out, working together, but also having a vision that is good for all, or good for a community. And that's a tough change to make. That's like changing our whole political culture in some respects. But I think that's one of the things that women can contribute, is that we do that more easily as a rule, I think. I don't know if that answers the question, but the barriers are collective, so the solutions need to be collective, I guess is what I'd say.
I think that historians and maybe political scientists, I wouldn't speak for them, but maybe would say, civil society, like our strengthening civil society, right? So local politics, and this has been since Robert Putnam's famous book on Bowling Alone, right? We need to strengthen democracy by finding these local ways in which you can get past a partisanship that and sort of practice cooperation, practice accepting diversity of opinions. The U.S. is also very commodified political culture that follows two parties and two parties only, which is very rare in the world. So that's asking two parties to represent hundreds of millions of people, right? That's a very big ask, and yet people in the U.S. are like, it would just be chaos if there were more parties. My God, chaos. And it's like, no, actually it works really fine. But it does require a lot of civil society, and it requires a lot of cooperation. So, I think that's what you seem to be pointing to. And then I would just say probably we need to stop trying to all be leaders. I don't, and a lot of people, especially when it comes to intersectional movements, like in my town, I just need to shut up a lot for the most part, when we get to ableism conversations about local school turf, when it gets to inclusion of transgender kids, when it gets, that's, you have to show up for and be your allies and be active, but you don't have to be the voice. I'm not the voice of every community. So, I do think it requires that humility in general for whatever identity you are, women or otherwise, to make a better political culture.
Yeah.
If I can just pick up on that, because I think both of you are talking really, I've raised this important issue of society, right, and kind of the grassroots. And I would also say for individuals, for women, candidates themselves, to push back, right? I think that as you may know, former President Trump questioned Kamala Harris's racial and ethnic background, right? He did this in an interview with the National Association of Black Journalists. And when she was asked about it, she said, I'm not going there, right? I'm just not engaging this, right?
I questioned whether or not she worked at McDonald's.
Well, yeah, there's that too, I know. But, she said, I'm not engaging that. She is not her. When she tells her life story, she doesn't discuss this relationship. I almost feel kind of, it's like not right to bring this up, except that it's in the news. And so, okay, address it. It's in the news. That's part of her story. That's not her whole narrative, right? And it's not even, I would venture to say, it's not even a large part of that narrative, right? And so I think it's important for women to push back as candidates when they're being asked questions or being when questions are raised that just don't seem fair or right or reasonable. And I would say that's important for all of us, too. A criticism that the vice president gets a lot is her laugh. If you just look at all of these ads, right, or if you look at kind of media that are critical of her, you'll see a lot of things where they just kind of, I don't know where that's coming from. But it seems like if you don't like her laugh, fine. You probably just don't like her anyway, right? But I think it's kind of pushing back against things like that, or just like articles about someone's attire. And I think it's a challenge for women. In the 2020 campaign, Senator Klobuchar did a whole feature on this dish in Minnesota, hot pot, right? Or hot dish, or whatever. It was like a casserole dish. Right, it sounded really good. But at any rate, it becomes, it's tricky because how do you kind of make yourself a person without suddenly becoming kind of, okay, this person's more interested in cooking. Actually, Vice President Harris loves cooking and has actually gone on shows. You can find videos of that. And she's been able to kind of incorporate that in a way without making it soft. But as vice president, her office had to be really careful, particularly in the first year when she was going on trips abroad, that sometimes there would be appointments made where they would say, her staff would say, that's really more for the spouse of the vice president, not for the vice president. And so really trying to kind of make clear, right, she's holding this office. She's the second highest elected position in the country. And so I would say it's kind of, as much as it's grassroots, and it's also pushback from candidates and from people who, when you see issues that just seem are being covered unfairly, I would say.
Thank you. I just had this question during Dr. Longmire's talk originally. Do you think that grassroots movements lose their integrity when they succeed? So in the case that they're pushing for a candidate to get elected, that candidate gets elected, things don't go as planned, and then, or things do go as planned, but they lose support. Do they gain support? How do movements, what does their long term look like after they reach their goals?
What a good question. So I'll just speak to the two instances that I talked about in Northern Ireland and the Women's Peace Movement in Liberia. In both cases, and I don't think we can generalize from this, but in both cases, those movements, those organizations dissolved eventually. In other words, they were able to, and maybe this is part of the humility, maybe it's part of the moving on. It's not like there's this great scene in Pray the Devil Back to Hell where they've gone through this incredible struggle. They've eventually elected Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as president. They are working with former child soldiers. Incredible things have been accomplished. But they then kind of go back to dissolve into civil society and the community. But what's beautiful about it was they say, but we're there, we're paying attention, we know we have power now, and if need be, we will reorganize, we will be there, we will be monitoring the situation. So it's a little bit like, who was it, Robert Bella, that said democracy is paying attention. And that's kind of what they had become, the sort of guardians, the maternal guardians of this absolutely war-torn community with all kinds of problems. But again, they know their own power now, right? They know how to organize, they know how to come together. They see their role as being kind of monitors and guardians of the society in a kind of mother power kind of way. And even when the UN came in to disarm people, they said, we're not disarming to the UN, we'll disarm to these women in the Peace Coalition because they're our mothers, they are our sisters, they know us, they are here to help us. So you could say mission accomplished, but there's also this sense that they're there, right? And again, if there is a new challenge, a new task, they will reorganize. Similarly, with the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland, they too are not now a discrete, separate organization and political force as they were. But you know what? They succeeded. The political hierarchy, both in formal parties and in grassroots civil society movements in Northern Ireland, is heavily female, right? And so, again, I think you could say, okay, mission accomplished. And in some ways, not only the, the humility of that, but also that sense that it's not about we maintaining our own power for the sake of our own power kind of thing, if that makes sense. It's a kind of, the task is what is important. And rather than perpetuate, an organization where the work has been accomplished. And again, it doesn't mean everyone goes home, but it means that those energies, those talents, those experiences are now woven into the whole society in ways that are transformative, not as a discrete, separate group or organization. So again, I don't think there's a formula here, but I think your question is a really important one. What next? What then? What happens to these organizations? And of course, it's really important because too often, some of you may know, what's her name? Frances Fox Piven's book about poor people's movements, it's called, or a couple of her books. But again, she's warning us about the ways in which critical social movements can be used almost as a new form of control or a new form of management. And so the fact that many of these women's groups are much more mindful of that, again, I'm overgeneralizing, but then many men's groups, which are more about, let's keep going. We've got the power now, right, kind of thing. So again, hard to generalize, but I do think, at least with these two examples that I mentioned, the fact that they have, it's almost like their energies have then been transformed into, and exploded is the wrong word, but seeped into the larger society as a whole in ways that are truly transformative. But the specific organizations, perhaps are dissolved in that process. I don't know. Again, it's hard to overgeneralize these things, but certainly in those two cases, I think that's what happened.
All right, so I have one more question, and then I'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. What role does mentorship play in supporting women's leadership development? Do you have any role models in your own career? What made them effective leaders? And what qualities should young women aim to have to be women leaders as well? It's a dense one.
Both these colleagues were really wonderful to me when I started at Hofstra. So I should say.
Feel old?
Yeah.
Well, you were here like one more year, so I'm just being,
I'm by far the oldest. So.
But that's true. That's true. And the women's and gender studies whole kind of group was really important to me. But when I went to graduate school, I studied political economy in Latin America, and all of my professors were men. And they were great, actually. They were great feminists. So it's an a little bit of an awkward question, only because that's who my advisors were. But I remember I was sexually harassed by this person who has retired. I was a graduate student. I was really young, and he was really very important in his field in some respect. And I remember reporting it, and I knew what I wanted to happen, but there was no Title IX that was in place about mandatory reporting at that point. So I went to my advisor, and I said, I don't know what to do. I don't have to take a class with this person. I just kind of want to lodge the complaint for other people so that they can use my testimony. But I'm out of here. I have a fellowship. I'm moving to Chile by. So I left all this thing, and he took it, and he compiled and reached out to graduate students going back 30 years to get him fired. And it was very difficult. It was a lot of work for him. And, so that's the kind of stuff that I think made a great mentor, because it gave me belief in the system of it, that the university could still be a place to be trusted, that there was still a kind of democratic imperative to protect students, to protect free speech, to protect our intellectual endeavor in our community and safety in our community. So, I think it was absolutely vital. I think I would have left the academy. I think I would never have come back if I hadn't felt like there were people like him working towards that. And he left. He left soon thereafter and took a professorship at University of Virginia, where he does the same thing all the time, which is just working for the right causes. The threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever, I'm doing it wrong, but you know what I mean? There are just some people that will do that. And so that mentorship was the difference between me staying in this profession and not. And that came from a lot of women, but it also came from feminist men.
Wow. I'm sorry to hear that happen. And I'm glad you had such a strong support, that someone
I did.
came through on that, right? And institutionally, not just personally, right?
Yeah.
That made a difference. I would say I've had so many mentors that have really been influential, from my undergraduate days to graduate school, at work. And I would say in particular, some women mentors have been important at critical times. I would say in graduate school, the director of graduate studies at the time, when I guess for my second year of graduate school, was a woman. And graduate school is kind of tough. They say, when you're an undergraduate, you kind of, you finish and you think, I know everything. When you're a graduate student, you think, I don't know anything. And then when you're a professor, I don't know a lot, but I can teach. I can help continue the conversation.
Both know and don't know.
Right. I know what I don't know, which is something. But it's intimidating, and people are out to kind of, show they're ahead of you, and, there's a lot of competition in certain classes. And I remember that our director of graduate studies took a few of us, and I think it was mostly women, maybe not all, and said, you're all here. This department doesn't take risks. You wouldn't be here if they didn't think you could do the work. So you have to have confidence in yourself. And that came at a time that was very helpful. It was just, I wasn't sure what subfield I was doing in political science. I was changing my subfield from international relations to American politics, and that confidence was really important. I would also say that I taught at West Point at the military academy for 6 years, and I had my first child when I was there. And kind of hearing from, at one point, dealing with kind of the balance of, all of a sudden your world changes, and you think you're going to have control of things, and suddenly you're completely out of control because, a new person has their own interests, and they don't coincide with when you're trying to prep for class or finish an article or anything. But I remember conversations with people, like senior military leaders, talking about, in particular, one person said that her daughter, how she had to go to a special school, and this person was on the fast track and had a highly distinguished career in the military, has a family. She had to leave her daughter to go to this program for a short period, and she said when she was leaving, she just saw her husband holding the baby. She's like, I can't do this, but she did it. And she came back, and it worked out. And that personal part was also very important. So I would say it's the professional as well as the personal that's really important for mentoring. And it's important to seek out mentors, whoever they may be. And they, and it's doesn't have to be a woman, but people who can kind of build that confidence and tell you what you probably know, but you need to hear that you can get it done, and it will work out.
Yeah, let's see. I'll say something about when I was an undergraduate and the importance, and very similar to what you've just said. The personal is so important. Real learning, deep questioning can be very, disconcerting. It can be frightening for people to, particularly I think as an undergraduate. So I was originally from North Dakota, if you can imagine, like being an endangered species. But in any case, I went away to college when I was 17 to UC San Diego, and I knew so little about the world and what was going on. And my first TA for my philosophy class was Angela Davis, very well-known critical thinker. And of course, in the learning that was going on, my whole world was just turned inside out. It was very, very overwhelming, particularly given how ill-prepared I was for all of this that was going on in the world. And, I had never heard about sexism, racism, pretty much anything. And here my whole world is being questioned. And so that personal guidance and support meant everything to me at that critical and very vulnerable stage. So I couldn't agree more that yes, of course, it's about mentoring in terms of your intellectual learning and your academic learning, but particularly I think at this stage, that inside-out turning, critical questioning and reflecting that goes on can be overwhelming, as I'm sure we don't need to tell many of you. And so I do think that deep mentorship, which is again about the whole being, really, is absolutely critical. The other way in which that's been reaffirmed for me was with all the study abroad programs that I've done, because you get to know the whole person over a whole semester on the road together. And so it was very clear to me that way of mentoring towards others is absolutely so important as well. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Mentorship, not only in terms of career, in terms of external opportunities and conditions, but mentoring of the whole person in all of the complexity and challenges that each of us face, but particularly in these times, is absolutely critical.
Thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your answers. We have time for about 2 or 3 questions. If anybody would like to come up to the mic in the middle and ask a few questions to our presenters.
You couldn't have
Don't
answered
be
everything.
shy.
Okay. Don't worry.
Give you a second to gestate.
Okay.
So we could ask you guys some questions.
There's always that.
Always,
Oh,
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Dr.
Lippincott.
Thank you.
Oh,
Share.
you could add to.
Yeah.
Sure.
Do you want to take one of these, Veronica?
No, that's all right. Here, I'll speak loud. Dr. Bose, you were talking so much about the U.S. presidency, and I have to mention Shirley Chisholm.
Sure, of course.
She
Yep.
would have been 100 years old this
Yep.
year, and she ran for president. For those of you who don't know, she was a congresswoman from New York, and she ran for president in 1972. And one of her biggest challenges was the general lack of support that she had from all men, including black men. Mm-hmm. And can you speak on, have things changed, so to speak, from 54 years ago to now in terms of supporting a woman of color for president?
Yeah.
I'd just like to hear your insights because you're an expert in this field. So.
No, I appreciate the question. And actually, as I was talking about Congresswoman Schroeder, I was thinking about Shirley Chisholm, but I didn't want to kind of go into like the whole history and then talk about Geraldine Ferraro and so on. But I would say, yes, absolutely, things have changed. I mean, look at how quickly Vice President Harris locked in the nomination. Now, that's, we're talking about kind of grassroots. That's credit to the Democrats, right? After the Trump-Biden debate on June 27th, you had Democratic strategists, very successful ones, talking about how Democrats needed to have town halls in July. They should have Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, have these conversations, and then the party would decide at the convention. What a disaster that would have been, right? I mean, I don't want to kind of, lock out positions, not be kind of, we were talking about, Dr. Elsie was talking about the two-party system, and right, we're locking, but, time is important here, and the Democrats needed to consolidate quickly. A lot of people didn't think they would do that. So I think, and many of the candidates who were being suggested as possible alternatives, like Governor Pritzker of Illinois, Governor Newsom of California, I mean, he said very quickly that he wouldn't run, right? They very kind of quickly said that they weren't going to challenge, right? Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania was a possibility, right? I think the fact that the party united so quickly and without really knowing. Again, I mean, Vice President Harris's ratings have gone up. They're still not a majority, right? But neither are Biden's, and neither were Trump's actually during his presidency. So, there may be a number of factors here. But I think without a doubt, the fact that the Democratic Party consolidated so quickly is pretty significant. And I would say on the Republican ticket, the fact that Nikki Haley was the last one standing is pretty significant. And she did very well with fundraising. I'm curious to see what will come next for her. I think a lot of that depends on Election Day, obviously.
That being said, and of course, yes, absolutely things have changed, but never underestimate the deep-rooted sexism in the American culture. That I think there still is, and we see that in some of the polling that's going on, that there still is a lot to do. It's still a work. We are still a very big work in progress in this country in terms of, transforming gender relations and power. But yeah, that's, as I say, have things changed since then? Absolutely. Not enough. More ahead, hopefully.
Thank you all for attending today. Thank you again. Oh, a question. Oh,
Got 5 minutes.
thank you.
Let it percolate.
Yeah, this question's for Dr. Elsie. So how do you feel that if Kamala is elected, how do you think it would strengthen or worsen relations with Mexico?
Compared to the past presidency of Donald Trump, it would probably be an improvement, honestly. The Mexican presidents use the United States in their own discourses, how strong they are, how weak they are vis-a-vis U.S. presidents, and President Trump became a very important way for Mexico to assert its own national identity, right? We're not going to pay for that wall. That is ridiculous. F him. That was actually said by former presidents. I think that it would be very hard for Sheinbaum to not have a critical stance toward President Trump, given his past with Mexico and the things he said about Mexican immigrants. Whereas I think President Harris, it could possibly open new conversations, even though she's been fairly conservative in some ways and maybe not, said the things that Mexicans wanted her to say right off the bat. At the same time, I think it would be fresh, and I think that conversation would be, I would look at it with some degree of optimism, actually.
Trump is such a low bar.
It was such a polarizing thing, and so many Mexican politicians use that. So I think it would be very hard to kind of restart that relationship. She would have a lot of pressure to kind of show of like non-cooperation with him. Whereas if it was Harris, even though there are some critiques, I think she would have more of a mandate to have some cooperation around the border, around asylum cases, and how those are going to be handled, which is good. We need that. Thank you.
So I have it's like a 2-in-1 question. The first one is for Dr. Elsie as well. So you mentioned how after 2016, in Mexico, the Republicans kind of came towards the middle and the liberals came to the middle. And I was really interested in that because I think that's something that the United States lacks. So if you could just go into what that looks like. And then the second part of the question, which you also had touched on, in terms of other countries having multiple parties and how the United States that would look crazy. In terms of peace for Dr. Longmire, how would that look like if we were to kind of at some point partake in multiple parties and navigating that in a human rights and peaceful aspect? So
I would just answer quickly because I know time's of the essence, but I think the grassroots feminist movement, Ni Una Menos, was largely responsible for pushing both parties, more parties. Actually, they're coalitions of many parties. So Sheinbaum's part of the Morena party. These are kind of reconfigured, and it would take a long time probably to bore you with the whole history. But the short answer is that I think there was a kind of cross-class, cross-racial demand in Mexico to get rid of some of the old actors, to empower some of the grassroots women in particular, even those within the Catholic right, to start again, to look at corruption, and that has led to them both kind of moving into a space right now between the PRD and the Morena Party that's it's a rejection of a kind of militaristic 20th century way that they were fighting with each other, the pan and the pre. And that's a short answer to a very long, complicated question. Thank you, though, Isabel.
That's interesting, because I was thinking also when you were talking, Brenda, about, some of the changes, again, from below that have led up to this moment, which would include, for example, the 1994 Zapatista uprising, Subcomandante Ramona, and there were all kinds of rules about, representation of women in this critical social movement at the time. So I think, Mexico is wonderfly interesting because of all of these currents, these historical currents that have kind of led to this moment. And again, a long story. In terms of multiple parties and peace, I mean, I think all of these issues around human rights, around demilitarization, about social justice in all of these contexts, and certainly gender justice, are best served by a multiplicity of voices, and to the extent that a system could be changed to be more inclusive, as Dr. Elsie said, in terms of multiple parties. My intuition would simply be that could be conducive to much more, I would argue, progressive policies around peacemaking, around American foreign policy, around social justice, and all of these issues. That's a heavy lift. It's a heavy structural lift to change our basically two-party system to something which is more plural and where there are more voices and expressions, organizational expressions for people to participate. And anything that's good for political fitness, and I think that would be, is good for those kinds of issues. But again, a very heavy lift given the way the system is organized. Look at the difficulty just challenging the Electoral College in this country, So yeah, it's good to be thinking about what could make our political structures more responsive to these urgent issues of the day: peace, human rights, social justice, gender justice. But again, it's a very heavy lift. But it's a good question and good to be thinking about how that might happen.
Really quick, I just want to say thank you so much for for sharing so much insight the rest of the talk about. That's looking for more information. Feel free to share that feedback and talk to whether it's some or volunteering. Feel free to talk to myself or Department Director. Our mailing list also staff who are to get more information about daily. Thank you for everyone for attending to the best. We inviting are very glad for that today live off today. So we have the correct staff to start this great. Yeah.
Thank you.